Death by burning at the stake is surely one of the most horrifying methods of execution that humans have devised in a long line of horrifying methods of execution. And it's a form of death that's very commonly associated with authority and power in the Catholic Church in Europe. You'll hear stories of people being burned at the stake for having heretical ideas. Famously, Galileo was threatened with this punishment if he refused to recant certain ideas of his about physics and the universe that didn't square with church doctrine. And of course, it was the execution of choice for the Spanish Inquisition in their horrifying auto da fe, public ceremonies in which people would be burned at the stake for the viewing and instruction of others. So it's also, of course, something that we hear about in terms of burning witches. So it's a terrible punishment, but it's not one that we normally associate with Protestant Christians. Protestant Christians, in fact, have many stories of being on the receiving end of this punishment. And there are many stories of Protestant reformers who were trying to challenge some of the teachings or the abuses of power in the church of their day, who were put to death in this way. And yet 30 years after the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, we're going to see somebody burned at the stake by Protestant Christians. Now, if you're very confused already about who are Protestants and who are Catholics, you're in the right place. This is part of an episode on the Protestant Reformation, which goes into huge detail on how Protestant Christians differ from Catholics and how Protestant Christians even began to exist. You can find more detail on that in episode 1 and 2. But briefly, the Protestant Reformation is most commonly marked with a man called Martin Luther posting criticisms of the church publicly in 1517. And when he does this, he ignites a firestorm of anti-clerical sentiment across Europe, beginning in Wittenberg, radiating across what is now Germany, and going to an incredible distance, even reaching into England and as far away as Sweden. And the impact of his ideas is going to have a very real and destructive effect. Rome will be sacked, for example, by Protestant mercenary soldiers. Most of Europe will be engulfed by the wars of religion in the decades after, as newly formed communities of Protestant or Reformed Christians fight with the existing Catholic Christian communities for control of the religious and political structures in the territories where they live. So the impact of this Reformation is almost impossible to overstate. But one of the less talked about aspects of this is the fact that Protestants themselves at times took the very tools that the Catholic Church had used to crush their ideas and used them to crush the ideas of other people. And this episode will tell you that story. While Martin Luther is certainly the most well-known and famous voice of Reformed or Protestant Christianity, he was not the only voice. And a man called John Calvin is probably the second most famous exponent of Reformed Christianity. Arguably, Calvin had an even deeper impact on the institutions and on the development of the theology of Reformed Christianity. And he is the focus of our story today. You are listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is episode 3 in our series on the Protestant Reformation. John Calvin was born in 1509 to a middle-class family in France. His father worked as a secretary for the city's bishop, so his family was already directly connected to the church institutions and hierarchy of his day. In a strange parallel to the career of Martin Luther, who we covered in our last episode, John Calvin's father also wanted young John to take up a career in law. Unlike Martin Luther, who rebelled against his father's plans for law school, John Calvin complied, and in 1531 completed his Bachelor of Law degree. At this time, Martin Luther's ideas were spreading with incredible speed across Europe, due in part to the printing press, which made the cheap and rapid dissemination of ideas easier than ever before, and also because Luther was articulating deep anti-clerical sentiments and criticisms that were widely felt. And so many of the intellectuals, including in France, where Calvin was growing up, were inspired by Luther. And even if they disagreed with him, the talk was all about Martin Luther's writings. As people debated them, they criticized them, they agreed with them, but they couldn't stop talking about them. By the time Calvin finishes his law degree, it's 14 years after Martin Luther has posted his famous 95 Theses, and 6 years after he's caused additional scandal by being an ex-monk who got married to an ex-nun, thus illustrating his personal contempt for the laws of celibacy that had been so much a part of the institutional structure of the Catholic Church. Luther's call for radical reform was circulating through a whole slew of books and pamphlets which were widely read, even though the Pope had by now officially labeled Martin Luther a heretic. The newly appointed rector of Sorbonne University in Paris was a man named Nicholas Cop, and he was a good friend of John Calvin. In his inaugural address upon taking office, Nicholas Cop explicitly referenced ideas by Martin Luther, and not to criticize them, to support them. As soon as he did this, Cop found himself having caused an uproar. Not only did he lose his job shortly after earning it, but he found himself a man with a price on his head who had to leave not just his university, but the city in order to keep his head attached to his shoulders. So Nicholas Cop is on the run. But because of the scandal that he's caused by publicly affirming Martin Luther's heretical or forbidden ideas, people who are in Nicholas Cop's circle of friends are also under suspicion, and John Calvin is one of these. These ideas of Martin Luther, while widely read, were only held publicly by a small minority of people. Most of those who were in charge of institutions like universities or any church positions were staunchly Catholic and committed to driving out these dangerous and forbidden heretical ideas. Nicholas Cop was forced to flee France for a newly Protestant city in another country. He went to Basel in Switzerland. And John Calvin, realizing that the situation in Paris was getting increasingly uncomfortable, would soon follow his older friend. Protestant activists had been causing a great deal of outrage in Paris at this time by putting up placards with public criticisms of the way that the Catholic Mass was being conducted. They were basically putting into writing criticisms that Martin Luther had articulated. And this was causing a great deal of anger amongst church and city authorities. So there were calls for a crackdown and for driving out these troublesome Protestants. At this point, John Calvin decided it was a good idea to leave Paris, and he also left for Basel in Switzerland. He was at this time only 26 years old, and it was during his stay in Switzerland that he wrote the book which would make him famous, John Calvin's monumental Institutes of the Christian Religion. Historian Will Durant says of this famous book, quote, "It is the most eloquent, fervent, lucid, logical, influential, and terrible work in all the literature of the religious revolution," unquote. John Calvin would continue revising and expanding this book for many years to come, and in its final version, it was over 1,000 pages long. But it's shocking to realize how young he was when he wrote the first version of this book. Calvin's book articulates his theology, or his theory of God and Christianity. And in many ways, John Calvin takes Martin Luther's ideas and extends them to places that Luther himself hadn't articulated. Luther had said that people were saved by grace alone, that there was nothing that they could do in terms of good works that would be enough to satisfy the justice of God. In other words, according to Luther, we couldn't earn our way into heaven by being good people. However good we were, it would never be enough, and therefore only God's grace would be the thing that would allow people to enter heaven. Calvin expanded this idea further by claiming that before the foundation of the world, God had selected and chosen a small number of people that were going to be saved by his grace. And they were going to be saved from the fate of eternal damnation, which was what awaited most people. These fortunate few Calvin called the elect, and they had been chosen by God from the beginning of time through the mystery of God's unknowable will. This idea is called the doctrine of predestination, and it's the one that is most associated with Calvin's theology. So to be predestined is literally that your destiny has been selected for you before you're even born. That's what it means. It means your destiny has already been determined before you've even breathed your first breath. Calvin also said that these fortunate few had been given the gift of faith by God. They'd been given the gift of believing that they had already been saved through Jesus Christ. Calvin also asserted that election was a sort of inheritance of grace, and that in some cases it might be passed from the parents to the children, though not always. How could you know if you were a member of this fortunate small group? Well, Calvin said that there were signs. The gift of believing, or the gift of faith, was one of them. A morally exemplary life was another one. Going to church and performing all of the services and rituals that were there was another. So it wasn't that you were saved by these things, but it was, if you were doing these things consistently, it was evidence that you were probably already saved since the beginning of time. Once again, doing these things, participating in baptism and communion, didn't save you, but they were a sign that you had probably already been saved. Now, this is a confusing doctrine, and it's one that eliminates human choice and agency entirely. And critics of John Calvin have pointed out that if God selected some people before they'd even breathed their first breath or done anything at all to be saved, then God was also the author of sin. That if he had decided that some people were going to be saved before they'd ever done anything right or wrong, and others were going to be condemned to hell before they'd ever done anything right or wrong, then God was the author of everything, and it seemed a little bit unjust and sadistic to punish most human beings, or to decide to punish them, before they'd even done anything that was potentially worthy of punishment. So Calvin's doctrine of predestination is a confusing doctrine, and it's one that eliminates human agency and choice entirely. You are already saved or damned long before you're born, and there's nothing you can do about it. Critics pointed out that this made God the author of sin, because if he foresaw everything and decided that some people were going to be saved and some people were going to be damned, then he had also permitted sin, and therefore it seemed unjust to punish some people for doing things that they essentially couldn't help but do. In other words, if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, then ultimately everything that happens is the will of God. So both the bad things that people do and the fate that's been decreed for them before they even do any of those things are the doing of God. Calvin also took a very dim view of life on earth. He saw it as exile from our eternal home and described life as existing in a sepulcher or a tomb. Not much of an optimist. Now, Calvin's massive book was first published in 1536, and this was also the year that he made a journey that would change his life. He was passing through the Swiss city of Geneva, which a mere 2 months earlier had declared itself to be a Protestant city. There was an explosion of these newly Protestant communities, or cities that had now declared themselves members of this sort of new Christian community. So Geneva was one of them. And as Calvin is passing through, he's appealed to by some of the Protestant leaders in that city who say, stay with us and help us solidify this Reformed Christianity in this place. And Calvin is very reluctant. I mean, his plan is to pass through Geneva on his way elsewhere. He has no plans to stay. He was very reluctant, but after being threatened with a holy curse if he were to continue going on his way, he agreed to stay and help. Now, it wouldn't be an easy task that lay before Calvin and the other Protestant reformers in the city. Until recently, Geneva had been Catholic, like most other cities in Europe. And there'd been a movement within the city to change that and to declare Geneva Protestant. And this movement received a lot of support from the population, but it was mainly because they were trying to escape the control of a fairly autocratic bishop, who was the church authority in the city at that time, and obviously a Catholic. So they wanted to get rid of this guy, and a lot of people thought that one way of doing that would be to become Protestant, so that he would officially have no further authority over them. But what being Protestant meant was a different picture depending on who you asked. And so some of the really devout Protestants in the city who wanted to be Protestant, whether there'd been a bishop or not, were anxious to reform the rest of the city to align with this purist vision. And this was the project in which they enlisted John Calvin's assistance. But many people in Geneva weren't terribly enthusiastic about this, and they became even less enthusiastic as John Calvin and his friends began to systematically try to change the rules to bring about more moral reform. So unpopular were these reforms that by 1538, barely 2 years later, John Calvin and William Farel, the man who'd prevailed upon him to stay in Geneva, were both kicked out of the city by the rest of the population. They were unwelcome, them and their reforms. But 3 years later, as the Protestant movement in Geneva began to seem increasingly shaky, city leaders invited John Calvin back. So why was Calvin so unpopular? Well, when he comes back and is given much more of a free rein in terms of implementing the reforms he has in mind, it's going to become obvious why he made so many enemies. To begin with, unlike Martin Luther, John Calvin thought that only the clergy, meaning the churchmen, the educated churchmen, were capable of reading and interpreting the Bible. This may seem like a minor detail, but it's actually enormously significant. One of the things that made Martin Luther's ideas so radical was his claim that anybody, man or woman, could read the text of the Bible and understand for themselves what it meant. Luther asserted that the message of the Bible was clear and it would be obvious to anyone who read it. There was only one message in the Bible. Anyone could deduce what it was. Now, Luther himself was quite surprised to find that when men and women across society did begin reading the Bible in translation, they came up with some very different ideas about what it meant than what he had. So his belief that there was just one clear message was going to be shaken by events that unfolded. But Calvin takes a different tack. And in so doing, he dismisses what had been a very egalitarian concept that Luther had introduced. Because when Luther says anyone, any man or woman can read the text and understand what it means, he's saying you don't need experts. You don't need priests. You don't need the Pope. You don't need experts in church tradition and theology to tell you what God wants. You can just read the text and understand for yourself. And so it was very much empowering for the individual man or woman, and particularly for women, because they had essentially very little role of any kind in the church. So to be told that they could read the Bible and interpret it for themselves was a radical statement. But Calvin is having none of it. He has a much more traditional perspective. Only churchmen, trained clergy, are capable of reading the text and understanding what it truly means. That was proposition number one. Number two is that a law in any society should reflect the will of God. But what's the will of God? What the trained churchmen tell you it is. So what John Calvin created in Geneva was a theocracy. Now, if you learned the word theocracy in school, you learned that theo meant God and cracy is rule, and so theocracy is rule of God. But that's really quite deceptive, because we don't actually know what God wants. We know what people say God wants. And in this case, what John Calvin and his friends were telling the people in Geneva that God wanted. So it's rule in the name of God. It's rule usually by clergy or religious authorities. That is what was going to unfold in Geneva. So the newly formed Protestant churchmen in Geneva had an increasingly powerful role. They read the text, and then they told the civil authorities, the city authorities, what the rules should be. And those rules were rewritten according to what the churchmen said. So if John Calvin and the other men on the church council banned someone from church, the city authorities would also exile that person from the city. So if you stepped outside the moral rules that were being established by John Calvin and the Council of Churchmen, it wasn't just that you would be not welcome at church and that you would be forbidden from taking communion. You would also be kicked out of the city, so you would become homeless. You would lose your job. You would lose your social connections. You would lose your property. It was severe. Now, I want to point out here that what's going on in Geneva in terms of John Calvin and the church council being in control of the city is very different from how Protestant communities are being organized in other parts of Europe, like Germany. Because in those places, Protestant communities are very much under the rule of the political authority. So the city authorities or the duke or nobleman who ruled a particular area, they would very much obey the rules of that political authority. So you had in the rest of Europe, political authority and Protestant religious communities underneath it. But here in Geneva, you have Protestant religious authorities ruling over the secular political ones. The fact that Protestant communities elsewhere in Europe were so subordinate to the political authorities where they lived was one reason why they were tolerated. So it's kind of astonishing that John Calvin was able to achieve this reversal. Calvin was intent on avoiding the fragmentation that was beginning to afflict these Protestant communities across Europe, as it did from the very beginning and continues to do to this day. What do I mean by fragmentation? Well, it comes right down to what Luther said. He said, any man or woman can read the Bible and understand what it means for themselves. And that's exactly what they did. The problem was they began coming up with radically different answers about what the Bible meant. And as people developed different answers, they began to collect in different communities. So some people thought that, for example, babies should not be baptized. We should only be baptizing adults. And these people were called the Anabaptists. So if you agreed with that interpretation of what the Bible meant, you might join an Anabaptist community, and you would be practicing and gathering in a different place from other communities of Protestants who might identify themselves as Lutherans, for example. There had already been a huge scandal in Germany quite recently because a group of Anabaptists had taken over a city called Münster. And from 1534 to 1535, they established a radical community there, very cult-like. It was tightly controlled by a couple of men who abolished personal property, instituted polygamy, and exercised an enormous amount of control over every aspect of life for the population of Münster. This brief chapter lasted less than a year, sometime between 1534 and 1535, and was brought to an end when the city was put under siege by the political authorities and the Catholic bishop who had previously ruled that city. They starved out the population, and then they took the leaders of this Anabaptist Protestant community and they executed them horribly. But what's fascinating about Münster isn't the level of insanity that went on in that city, although that is fascinating, but the downstream effect of this episode. because Catholics across Europe would point to that and say, see, this is what the ideas of Martin Luther lead to. They lead to chaos. They lead to common shoemakers and tradesmen taking the Bible and saying, oh, I know what the will of God is, and establishing radical, crazy communities that rebel against the religious, the political, and the social order. This is why Martin Luther and all these Protestants are dangerous. So Munster became this example of what was wrong with Protestant ideas across Europe. It was a byword. But for Protestants as well, many of them, including Martin Luther and John Calvin, were equally horrified by Munster. They didn't want any part of that kind of activity. They didn't want to be associated with it. And so they had to find ways to distance themselves and to say, what happened in Munster does not represent us, and that we're perfectly capable of having well-organized, orderly, sane communities. We are not like the Anabaptists of Munster. And so to understand what's going to start happening in John Calvin's Geneva, we must recognize that the specter of Munster is very much in his mind and the minds of his contemporaries. After all, it's only happened. In fact, it happened the year before he was summoned into Geneva. So it's very recent. If you want to know more about Munster and this fascinating moment of madness in European history, I highly recommend Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. You have to search back in his archives a couple of years, but he did do a very detailed episode on Munster. It may be because of this memory of Munster that John Calvin is so obsessed with top-down regulation of religion in Geneva and of really tight control by himself and other clergy on the church council over what ideas are going to be recognized and allowed and which are not. And of course, rules are only effective if they are enforced. And so the level of enforcement that was instituted in Geneva was also going to be severe. But before we get into that, there were a number of other fascinating innovations that happened in Munster during this time. Some of the measures that Geneva was known for and admired for actually predate John Calvin himself. In 1536, before Calvin was invited into the city council decided to fund a public school. So they made public education mandatory for all the children in the city, but if a child came from a family that could not afford to pay the school fees, then that child would be allowed to attend the school anyway, and the fees that made this possible were raised by the city council. So this was a radical move, the idea of public education even for the poorest families. And this was going on in Geneva and continued during Calvin's time in that city. All the inhabitants of Geneva were required to attend church on Sundays and also to try to attend any weekday services that might be held as well. So this rule already existed. But when Calvin came back into the city the second time in 1541, he tightened up and reinforced some of these regulations. When Calvin returned to Geneva, he preached 3 or 4 times a week. So we're not just talking about going to church on Sunday. We're talking about going to church every other day, essentially. And people were expected to arrive on time and sit for the sermons. If you arrived late, you were given 1 warning. And if you arrived late after that, you were given a monetary fine. You were assigned a penalty that you had to pay for showing up in church late on a Wednesday for John Calvin's second sermon of the week. Heresy, which in this case was wrong religious belief as defined by John Calvin and his council, was a capital crime and punishable by death. Now think about this for a moment. Heresy was a term that the Catholic Church had used to essentially indicate Protestant beliefs. Heresy used to mean wrong belief as defined by the Pope was heresy. But John Calvin was going to take this term and give it a new content. Heresy in this case would be wrong belief as defined by John Calvin. Equally a serious offense, equally punishable, but the difference would be the content of the beliefs that were deemed to be wrong. Obviously, being a Catholic was heretical in John Calvin's Geneva, but any number of other ideas could also receive this label. And it's astonishing to me that John Calvin seems either oblivious or unbothered by the fact that he's borrowed the entire institutional structure of the Catholic Church, complete with the hierarchy of who's allowed to interpret the Bible and tell everyone else what it means, as well as the punishment structure of up to and including execution for people who fail to follow the approved doctrines. John Calvin borrows all of this wholesale. He just changes the content of the doctrines that are approved and disapproved. From 1542 to 1546, 58 people were executed for heresy in Geneva, and another 76 were banished, essentially becoming homeless for falling afoul of the rules that John Calvin and the Council of Churchmen had established. If you average that out, it means that there were more than 16 executions a year during this period for heresy. That's more than one a month. Do you think that that would have a chilling effect on freedom of speech or freedom of thought? Absolutely. But the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of thought is one that actually arrived later. It didn't really exist at this point, and this is why. Now, these deaths are separate from the crime of witchcraft, because during the same 4-year period, in 1 year, there were 14 women who were burned at the stake for witchcraft because people in the city accused them of conspiring with the devil to bring the plague to Geneva. So you add that up, and that is a lot of dead people. When he wasn't busy enforcing clerical power through execution, John Calvin gave some thought to devising a new institutional structure for the Reformed Protestant Church, because the Protestants, since Martin Luther, had essentially rejected the existing institution. They didn't recognize the Pope. They didn't think that cardinals or bishops or priests were necessary. So if you were going to erase all of those things, what would you put in their place? John Calvin said that the Bible supported 4 positions, and they were pastors, doctors, elders, and deacons. So a pastor is essentially the Protestant version of a priest. He's the one who does the day-to-day ministry to people in the congregation. He visits them. He gives the sermons on Sunday. He knows everybody individually. Doctors were involved in teaching and scholarship, sort of developing the theology, and John Calvin put himself in this category. Elders were involved in the administrative and oversight duties of the church, and deacons were responsible for organizing charitable activities. Now, many of these terms are going to sound familiar to those of you who've grown up in Protestant churches. You will have heard of elders or deacons and pastors, and you can thank John Calvin for that, because he's the one who really set down these offices and institutionalized them, because prior to him, they didn't exist. But in Geneva, everyone was under moral scrutiny at all times. Church elders visited every family in the city annually, and they questioned them on all of their activities, things that they'd said, things that they'd done, things that they had been rumored to have done. Criticizing a minister or a member of the church council would get you a formal reproof or reprimand, and other things like beating your wife were also not allowed. So if that was something that they'd heard you done, then if the elder visited your family, he would address that and say, this is not allowed. You can't do it. If you keep it up, you'll be punished. Now, while that might seem to be a benefit and something that we should applaud, it wasn't so much the fact that wife beating was recognized as wrong that was a problem. I think most of us would agree that that's a good thing. But it was the idea that you would have church officials visiting your home and interrogating everyone, and then assigning you to punishments or to reprimands as necessary. And the rules extended to details of life that were far, far more trivial than the relationship you had with your spouse. For example, every choice that you might make, from the name you gave your child to the way a woman wore her hair, was subject to the oversight of these grave moral arbiters. One father spent 4 days in jail for daring to name his infant son Claude, which happened to be a name that was attached to a saint that had been popular in Geneva before the city had become Protestant, rather than giving his son the name Abraham or any one of the other approved Old Testament names that were on the list that the church council had assembled. So churchmen were busy telling people in the city what names they were allowed to give their children and what names they were not. Another woman was jailed for wearing her hair too high, piling it too loftily in a fashion that was considered to be immoral. So she was actually punished for a sinful hairdo. And of course, the Council of Churchmen censored what could be printed, and they began to assemble a list of books that they were going to ban. So once again, we see this bizarre mirroring of everything that the institutional Catholic Church had been doing for centuries to try to suppress ideas that they found threatening. And here in Geneva, John Calvin and his Protestant churchmen are doing exactly the same thing. Only religious plays could be performed in the theaters of Geneva. There were rules about how much clothing you could own and in what colors. There were approved colors of clothing and disallowed colors of clothing. There were even rules about the number of dishes and cutlery that you could have in place settings at your dining room table. Dancing, swearing, and card playing were not allowed. And this sort of idea, these three activities being banned, is something that Calvin brings in and has circulated amongst many Protestant communities ever since. It's sort of been automatically frowned on. And it's something that even I saw in churches in the 20th century being repeated. So thank you, John Calvin, for making dancing a terrible sin. Now, there were severe penalties for other offenses. If you had sex with someone who wasn't your spouse, said something that was deemed to be blasphemy, or practiced idolatry, which could even mean having a statue of the Virgin or some saint, you could be executed. If you had sex with someone, but neither of you were married, you could just be exiled, kicked out of your city, made homeless, sent away from everybody you knew and your job. There's actually a record of one child being beheaded for striking its parents in a horrifying echo of Old Testament commandments that children who disobey their parents should be killed. Of course, in deciding guilt or innocence when a person was accused of a crime, it was perfectly standard in Geneva, as it was across Europe at this point, to use torture to extract either confessions or evidence. So it wasn't that the use of torture was unique, it was that the list of actions that could get you tortured or potentially executed was much longer in Geneva, because the amount of control that was being extended into the private lives of individuals had grown so enormously. While Calvin's Geneva was a frighteningly regulated society, this much at least must be said for him. He's a man who seems to have lived scrupulously according to the standards that he promulgated for others. And this meant that he ate very sparingly. He slept as little as possible, by some records about 6 hours a night. And he worked tirelessly during his waking hours on his writing and on his church duties and on the meetings with the council and the city. So the fact that he exerted all of his efforts in this direction of reform as he saw it, it has not been questioned by anybody really. Whether the vision that John Calvin had was one that you would want to live in is another question. But the fact that he dedicated himself unstintingly to that vision seems to be without doubt. He also refused increases in income and had no interest in sort of improving his wealth or in acquiring more comfortable clothing or living standards whatsoever. He married a widow who had children from a previous marriage and lived, by all accounts, a very contented life with her until her death. There are some records that indicate that some members of Calvin's own family fell afoul of the moral laws. So one of his stepdaughters from his wife's previous marriage was at one point accused of adultery. We don't have any record of her execution, but she may have been exiled. And John Calvin's brother had a wife who was repeatedly accused of adultery. And again, there's some doubt as to whether or not she was guilty. She maintained her innocence under torture for many days on one of the occasions when she was accused. But eventually this wife was also exiled from the city, leaving John Calvin's brother free to marry again. So the records on what was done to members of his own family, if they fell afoul of the rules, are mixed, but they certainly weren't exempt. This much we can know. But one of the things that people said about Geneva was that the provision made for the poor in the city was worthy of admiration. And this is something that Calvin himself worked on quite extensively. The church council took measures to curb monopolies on food sales, for example, so that the price of bread and other basic necessities remained within reach even for the poorer families in that city. So one of the many incredible impacts that John Calvin had on Protestant Christianity was bringing verses to the Bible. You've heard people quote things like John 3:16 or Romans 10:12, right? They're quoting chapter and verse. And the verse is a little number that's assigned to a few sentences, sometimes only one sentence, that allows you to take a chapter of the Bible and divide it into these much smaller sections of text called verses. And Protestant Christians are inordinately fond of quoting chapter and verse on everything. So this is something that actually came to the Bible during John Calvin's stay in Geneva, because there was a translation of the Bible produced by some English expats, I believe. They called it the Geneva translation. And verses are introduced at this time. And this supports John Calvin's obsessive focus on discussing the detail of every particular word and every line of the text of the Bible, which he's constantly expounding in his multiple times a week sermons. And so by dividing the text into these much smaller sections with little numbered verses, they allowed people to reference exactly the section of text that he was referring to. And it's become standard ever since. Oddly, it could be argued that Protestant Christians are responsible for sacralizing or making sacred the text of the Bible. And what I mean by that is, prior to Martin Luther and John Calvin, Christianity was experienced very differently. The only version of Christianity that people knew in Western Europe was the Catholic one. And so that was a religious experience that was informed by church art, beautiful stained glass windows, paintings, altarpieces, where scenes from the Bible were artistically represented in often very emotion-inducing ways, and where the Mass was recited in Latin, a language that most people in the church didn't understand. So for them, it was like a magical incantation. But they were a series of ritual actions and words and sounds that were repeated and that accompanied the religious experience. Furthermore, other religious activities were experienced in the body. So things like doing penance, which could involve kneeling for a certain amount of time and saying a certain number of prayers with a rosary, the beads of which would pass through your thumb and your finger, or even making your way up a certain number of steps on your knees, or going on a pilgrimage, walking for miles over a period of days, weeks, or even months. These things were standard parts of the experience of Christianity for so many people. So the focus on words and the meanings of words wasn't really a part of that. We get that because of Martin Luther and John Calvin, who come in and say, get rid of these traditions, get rid of this church art, get rid of these traditions of interpretation. We don't want any of that. We don't want pilgrimages. We don't want statues. We don't want saints. We just want this text, because in this text of the Bible is everything we need to know. And so there is an obsessive focus on analyzing grammar and words and how words in one book might relate to words in another and cross-referencing. All of this is a Protestant obsession, and it reshapes the experience of Christianity in quite a radical way, quite a cerebral, verbal way. as opposed to an emotional and physical experience. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the number of people who'd been executed and exiled, John Calvin attracted a large number of enemies in Geneva. Despite the fact that even speaking disrespectfully of John Calvin or other churchmen was a crime, there was a faction in the city that deeply resented Calvin and hoped to expel him. On one occasion, in 1547, a placard was found anonymously posted or attached to John Calvin's pulpit, the stand that he would rest his papers on when he was giving a sermon. And this placard basically said that John Calvin should leave the city or fear the consequences. So it was a threat. A man named Jacques Gruet was arrested and held on suspicion of being the author of this placard. And so while he was in detention, the authorities searched his house. They went through his papers, they were reading his letters, looking for any evidence that he was the man responsible for this threat. Now, according to a letter written by John Calvin himself to a friend at this time, Calvin says in his letter, "I didn't find anything in Jacques Gruet's house that matches the placard. The handwriting doesn't match. We don't have any firm evidence that he's the author. But we found other writings in his study that contain wrong ideas, objectionable ideas, things that are against the rules." And John Calvin says, "I don't even think that he's the author of these other ideas, but if he copied them down into his diary or his books, then he's responsible for these other ideas." So we've moved from arresting Jacques Gruet for being the author of a threat on a placard to recognizing that there's no evidence that he's the author of that threat, but while doing a random search through his house, we found some other things that we don't like, and so we're going to punish him anyway. This is exactly what happens, and Calvin's letter testifies quite clearly that this is what he saw going on. So they keep Jacques Gruet in jail, and they torture him twice a day for 30 days, until he finally confesses to whatever they want him to say. He's then tied to a stake, his feet are nailed to a stake, he's beheaded, and his body is displayed as an example to others. This is what happens if you dare to make threats to John Calvin or the Council of Churchmen in Geneva. However, this was not the only sickening ending that John Calvin would be responsible for. In 1546, during the height of power for John Calvin's Theocracy in Geneva, when they're burning more than 16 people every year, a man named Michael Servetus sends Calvin a book. It was a book called Christianity Restored, and it contained many ideas that were objectionable, including a rejection of the doctrine of the Trinity. So the Trinity, of course, is a very, very traditional church teaching that says God is a three-part person, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And these three aspects of God are both distinguishable but also united. It's complicated, it's confusing, but it's been part of Christian theology since very early times. And so for Servetus to reject the Trinity was something that was kind of a radical thing to do. Now, Michael Servetus was not a Catholic. He had embraced many Protestant ideas, and he was also a scholar. However, the vision of God that he'd come up with was quite different from many others. He'd rejected the Catholic version, but the direction that his ideas had developed was not one that was shared by many other Protestants, John Calvin included. There are some who say that Michael Servetus was eccentric. He was certainly extremely well educated, but even if you think that he became a total lunatic, what's going to happen to him is really hard to justify. So Calvin responds to Michael Servetus by sending him a copy of his own book, The Increasingly Weighty and Ever-Growing Institutes of the Christian Religion. And then Servetus sends it back with notes in the margins, disrespectful notes where, like a scholar, he's quarreling with particular statements that Calvin is making, and because he has the education and the background to do it, he's able to play the same game that Calvin does. He can sort of fence with Calvin intellectually. They are members of the same scholarly discipline. So he writes back these disrespectful annotations all over Calvin's, life's work, and then sends him about 30 letters in which he quarrels with various ideas that Calvin has expressed, and sometimes, expresses kind of open contempt for these things. Now, this must have been really hard for Calvin to take, because he was used to being held in great respect. I mean, no one dared even to speak a criticism of Calvin because it was a crime that could get you punished. So he'd become used to walking everywhere and being shown deep respect and agreement with whatever he said. And so it must have been really quite aggravating to have someone who showed no such deference and was willing to quarrel and even make fun of some of Calvin's most cherished ideas. So Calvin was used to being feared and deferred to. He finds this intolerable. And John Calvin then writes a letter to a friend of his about this correspondence in which he says, quote, "Servetus has just sent me a long volume of his ravings. If I consent, he will come here," meaning to Geneva, "but I will not give my word. For should he come, if my authority is of any avail, I will not suffer him to get out alive." Now that's a chilling statement, isn't it? He's basically saying, if this guy is within my reach, he's not going to leave my city breathing. So this tells us the level of hostility that Calvin felt towards Servetus at this time. Now, Calvin didn't wait for Michael Servetus to decide to come to Geneva. Michael Servetus was already a wanted man. I mean, he had these ideas that were unorthodox, that didn't fit with either Catholic or Protestant theology, and like many other people at this time, he'd been writing his ideas into pamphlets or books, sending them covertly to sympathetic printers, and having them printed and distributed across Europe, under a pen name, of course, as you would if you wanted to stay alive. But John Calvin really has this animus for Michael Servetus at this point. He's out to get him. And so he actually tips off Catholic Inquisition authorities in the region of France where Michael Servetus is living undercover. So the Inquisition was the branch of the Catholic Church that was dedicated to identifying and punishing heresy, or wrong belief as defined by the Catholics. John Calvin himself would have been arrested by the Inquisition if he lived in that part of France. Remember, he left France for Geneva to escape Catholic punishment for being a Protestant. Remember that. So now we have John Calvin from the safety of Geneva, where he's not under Catholic authority, writing a letter to the Catholic Inquisition authorities in France to tip them off and say, "Psst, yeah, that guy who's writing all those pamphlets and books that you want to catch, he's actually living there right under your noses. His name is Michael Servetus, and you can find him at this address." So based on a tip-off from John Calvin, Michael Servetus is arrested by Catholic Inquisition authorities in France. Now, Servetus is no fool, so he's wisely burned any papers or drafts of his controversial writings, which were later published. And he does this because he knows that if he's arrested, his house is going to be searched. So, sure enough, the Inquisition authorities put him in jail. They search his house and his papers, and they can't find anything that he's written in his house that's objectionable. So the investigators needed more proof that Servetus was the author of these heretical writings that had been published. They didn't have enough evidence. So John Calvin is willing to help them out again, and he sends them some copies of the letters that Michael Servetus has sent to him. So imagine, Servetus, a self-identified Protestant, has been having these intellectual debates and correspondences with Calvin, who he considers to be someone he might disagree with, but essentially an equal, a colleague. And Calvin is now taking these ideas, these things that were sent to him personally in trust, and turning them over to the Catholic Inquisition so they can use them for evidence to condemn Servetus as a heretic, which they do. When they get these letters from Calvin, they decide that now they have the evidence they need, Servetus is a heretic, and they condemn him to be burned to death by a slow fire. they put that in the actual penalty. It's not enough you're going to be burned at the stake. We're going to make sure that it takes a really long time, so it's as horrific and agonizing as we can possibly make it. Fortunately, Servetus somehow manages to escape jail and flee the city, so he doesn't get executed by the Inquisition, although they were certainly planning on carrying that out, thanks to Calvin. So now he's on the run. Michael Servetus is traveling under a false name. He's running for his life, and he's obviously unaware of how he ended up in the Inquisition's hands in the first place, because he decides to pass through Geneva on his way to Zurich, which is his intended destination. So while he's in the city, he's still undercover, he's living under a false name, but he shows up in church because everyone in Geneva had to show up in church. If you didn't, it was a crime, right? So Servetus shows up in church with his disguise, his fake name or whatever it is, and someone recognizes him. And they tell John Calvin Servetus was spotted in church. And so Calvin has him arrested. Now at this point, things got awkward because Michael Servetus was not a resident of the city. He was just someone passing through. So he's not subject to the laws that the Council of Churchmen and the city authorities have made. Those apply to residents of Geneva. The most they can legally do is kick him out of the city and send him on his way. But remember, Calvin has already decided that Servetus needs to die. He's already written a letter to his friend long before this saying, if I ever get my hands on this guy, he's not going to leave my city alive. And so now that he has Servetus in custody, John Calvin has to find a way to execute him, even though there's no legal way that he should be able to do this. So Calvin starts writing to other Protestant leaders in Germany and Switzerland. He's looking for advice, or really permission. He's looking for agreement. So he writes about Servetus, he writes to these other Protestant community leaders, and some of them, not all of them, but some of them agree with Calvin that yes, Servetus should be executed. So emboldened by getting some agreement, Calvin is ready to proceed with this extrajudicial killing. The city authorities of Geneva decide that they want to give Servetus the death that has traditionally been reserved for heretics, which is death by burning at the stake. John Calvin is on record as saying he would have preferred a quicker form of execution, but he doesn't really attempt to get in the way or to change the verdict that the Genevan authorities have come up with. After all, the death of Michael Servetus would send an excellent message to John Calvin's own enemies in Geneva. So the more horrific a death it was, the more of a deterrent it might serve to be. Servetus himself apparently burst into tears in horror and disbelief in Geneva when he's told of the fate that awaits him. And certainly other Protestants across Europe didn't all agree with this either. From the other Swiss city of Basel, one critic witheringly wrote that Geneva proclaims the good news of the gospel with flames. So there wasn't, some sort of massive consensus about this action. It was something that Calvin had already decided he wanted to do, and he sort of campaigned to get enough consent to be able to carry it out, and that's exactly what he did. The irony here is that John Calvin borrowed wholesale the entire hierarchy and authority structure of the Catholic Church, including the authority of the clergy, which had to be unquestioned, that no common person could disagree with or criticize the teachings of John Calvin's church. And this horrific death of burning at the stake was a tool that the Catholic Church had used effectively for centuries to silence dissent, to silence criticism, to silence would-be reformers, just like John Calvin. And yet here he is using the same weapon against someone that he regards as an enemy. So John Calvin is going to use all of the institutions, all of the structures, all of the weapons that the Catholic Church used against people like him. The difference that he would have said was, well, our theology is right, and that makes everything okay. Now, it's worth noting here that John Calvin's severity and his willingness to borrow wholesale all of the coercive punishments that the Catholic Church had used wasn't shared by all Protestants. Martin Luther famously stood out against coercion at various points when it came to matters of religious belief. In 1522, Martin Luther wrote, quote, "Belief or unbelief is a matter of everyone's conscience. The secular power should be content to attend to its own affairs and permit men to believe one thing or another as they are able and willing, and constrain no one by force. For faith is a free work to which no one can be compelled." So Luther here is saying, look, we may think as Protestants that a lot of Catholic teachings are wrong, but we don't want Protestant rulers to be in the business of enforcing Protestant teachings on Catholics in their territory. Even if we think we're right, forcing someone to agree with us has no merit, right? It's not faith then, because faith is a free work. Saying to somebody, you're going to repeat these words and say you believe these things, otherwise you'll be burned at the stake as a heretic or kicked out of the city and lose your home. These weren't things that Martin Luther thought were particularly useful ways of proceeding. So he differs from Calvin in this respect. He was adamant that we, quote, neither can nor should force anyone into the faith. So Luther opposed this forceful conversion of Catholic communities into Protestants, which there was pressure for in some places in Europe as Protestant communities began to expand and become more powerful. Now, Martin Luther went back and forth, and some of his ideas were strongly influenced by the ways that other people lived them. So when the peasants rose up in Germany in rebellion against some of their aristocratic overlords, citing Martin Luther as an inspiration, he was horrified. And he wanted to distance himself from that and say, this is wrong, and your aristocratic lords have every right to subjugate you. So he would sometimes modify or backpedal his ideas when he saw that other people applied them in ways that he couldn't have anticipated and disagreed with. There was a period later in his life when Martin Luther became more hardline and said there might be an argument for forcing people to outwardly conform to a particular faith and practice and attend services and pay lip service to ideas that they don't believe in their hearts. But toward the end of his life, Martin Luther went back to his original position, which was to say, force is not a good idea. And basically, even if Catholics and other people with wrong beliefs are wrong, we need to patiently endure them. We can't force them to be something else. We can't force anybody to be a Protestant. John Calvin had an enormous effect on the shape of Protestant Christianity. He's credited not only with bringing verses to the Bible, but with inventing an entirely new institutional structure for how Protestant churches would be organized and how they would work. He also worked throughout his life to unite the ever-fragmenting Protestant communities under a common creed. And so in this way, the impact of his ideas reached far across Europe, as he was one of the authors of these creeds that joined what would have been otherwise separated Protestant communities of belief. While he died quietly in his bed in Geneva, his version of Protestantism had a very wide influence, not only across Europe, but even into England, where Puritans, who were the English version of Calvinist Protestants, broke away from the Church of England and eventually went to the New World. But that's another story for another episode. Martin Luther, John Calvin, and the other leaders of the Reform movement, which became known as Protestant Christianity, were men between two worlds. They had been born into a world in which the religious structure and the political structure worked together. And the religious structure they'd been born into was a Catholic one. And so you had the authority of the church under the Pope, which was religious, and the authority of the state under the king, which was political. And these two pillars supported each other. So when the church said that a certain idea was wrong or heretical, the state stepped in to enforce punishment for that. And when the state had an agenda, such as perhaps a war, the church could support that with teachings and with encouragement and with preaching. So the entire structure of medieval Europe had these two pillars of church and state that were mutually reinforcing. When Martin Luther had come out with these ideas which exploded, he basically rejected the entire institution of the Catholic Church, which left a gap. It was a gap that now required to be filled, and what the shape of the new social order would be was exactly the question that all of them were trying to work out. Calvin's answer was to take almost exactly the same shape and structure that the Catholic Church had and just fill it with Protestant content and allow it to operate in exactly the same way that the Catholic Church previously had, in partnership with the state. But there would be other answers. And the way that this question would finally be resolved would only be answered after more than 30 years of warfare that would destroy Europe. For more on that, you'll have to come back for episode 4 in this series. But this is Villains and Virgins podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing so you don't miss any further episodes and sharing it with someone else that you think would enjoy it.